Welcome to our channel. Today we celebrate the remarkable life and enduring legacy of Danny Thomas, a beloved entertainer and humanitarian. Best known for his groundbreaking sitcom, Make Room for Daddy, Thomas captured the hearts of audiences with his humor, charisma, and warmth. But his contributions went far beyond the screen. He dedicated his life to helping children through the creation of St. Jude Children's Research Hospital. Join us as we explore the life, career, and lasting impact of this iconic figure. Randolph Scott was born in 1903 in Orange County, Virginia. He came from a well-to-do family and attended the respected Woodbury Forest School. You could say he grew up pretty comfortably, surrounded by opportunities that many kids his age only dreamed of. But it wasn't just about the money or status. He was also a solid athlete, good at football, baseball, and swimming. Even with that privileged start, he didn't coast through life. Instead, he pushed himself to see how far he could go in various fields, including sports and eventually acting. He always had that spark inside him that made him want more than just a quiet, predictable life. Early on, Randolph Scott seemed drawn to the idea of acting, but his path to Hollywood wasn't a simple hop, skip, and jump. At 19 in 1917, he joined the U.S. Army. He was stationed in France as part of an artillery outfit, the 19th Field Artillery Regiment, serving as an artillery observer with the 2nd Trench Mortar Battalion. Back then, he had no clue just how important those military days would be in his later career. He honed his riding skills, practiced with firearms, and just got comfortable around horses. These talents turned out to be golden tickets when he eventually divided into Western films, where he needed to look natural in the saddle and believable holding a gun. During his time in the Army, Scott realized he loved performing. The Army sometimes organized little shows for the troops, and he found that being on stage in front of an audience, even if it was a makeshift one overseas, just lit up something inside him. It was a creative outlet, far different from the tough realities of military life. When the war ended, he figured, why not see if I can make this acting thing happen for real? So, after his discharge, that's exactly what he did. He headed to New York to study at the American Academy of Dramatic Arts. There, he became friends with future icons like James Stewart, forging bonds that would be crucial in Hollywood later on. At first, Scott wasn't sure how it would pan out. He was juggling the idea of maybe becoming a professional football player, a dream he'd nurtured while attending Georgia Tech and the University of North Carolina after the war. He had the physique and skill for sports, but a back injury derailed that plan. Still, he wasn't one to give up easily. He pushed forward, switched gears, and ended up earning a degree in textile engineering and manufacturing. It might seem like a strange detour for someone who would one day star in Western movies, but that's how life goes sometimes. In college, he also dabbled in stage productions and got that taste of an audience applauding his performances. That little spark he felt in France during Army shows grew into a real passion. He decided to give Hollywood a shot. By 1928, he landed there with an introduction letter from his father to Howard Hughes, the famous millionaire filmmaker. That letter smoothed his initial entry into the movie business, and he scored a small role in a film called Sharpshooters. The part wasn't huge, but it was an open door. He took it, made the most of it, and started meeting people who could help him climb the ladder. Back then, he wasn't some overnight sensation. He had to pay his dues, taking bit parts in movies like Weary River and The Virginian. His contributions were modest, but every role taught him something new. Interestingly enough, during The Virginian, he became Gary Cooper's dialogue coach. It doesn't sound like a glamorous gig, but it was the perfect chance to sharpen his acting instincts and build a valuable friendship with Cooper. someone who would eventually become a close friend and frequent co-star. As Scott kept building experience, talkies arrived. Silent films were on their way out, and the new medium required performers to have decent voices and a knack for delivering lines believably. Scott recognized the need to up his game. He got some valuable advice from Cecil B. DeMille, who basically said, "If you want to really grow as an actor, get on stage." Taking that advice, Scott joined the Pasadena Playhouse around 1932. There, he refined his acting technique, became more confident in his stage presence, and learned how to deliver lines in a way that felt natural. While performing in a play called Under a Virginia Moon, Paramount scouts spotted him. They liked what they saw, offered him a contract, and soon he found himself officially signed as a movie actor. His early career spanned different genres, everything from crime thrillers and comedies to adventure stories and romance. He was never the guy who turned his nose up at any role. If it paid and gave him a chance to learn, he was game. But it was the Western genre that ended up defining him. By the early 1930s, he started starring in a series of low-budget Westerns, many of them adapted from Zane Grey's cowboy novels. Titles like Wild Horse Mesa, Man of the Forest, and Sunset Pass in 1932 and 1933 gave him a solid grounding in the genre. It was essentially a Western apprenticeship. He learned how to carry himself like a frontier hero, how to shoot convincingly, how to ride a horse with the easy confidence of someone who had grown up on a ranch. All those army days on horseback really paid off. The more he did these roles, the more the audience recognized him as that tall, rugged guy who always seemed at home in the saddle. Even so, he didn't stay boxed in as a Western actor right away. In the mid-1930s, he surprised people by starring in musicals with Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers, films like Roberta and Follow the Fleet. He even popped up in a horror flick called Supernatural with Carole Lombard. It might sound random, but it shows that Scott wasn't afraid to experiment and see where his talents might shine. All the while, though, he kept stepping back into Westerns, refining that persona and sharpening his approach to playing heroes who were often quiet yet strong. Around the same time, he starred in The Last of the Mohicans, which turned out to be a big success. He portrayed Hawkeye, a frontiersman who'd been raised by a Mohican chief. The film was praised for its beautiful visuals and gripping action sequences, and critics noticed Scott's commanding presence. His steady, understated performance left an impression on viewers, many of whom didn't realize that up to that point, he'd mostly been tackling smaller or B-list parts. The Last of the Mohicans helped catapult him onto Hollywood's radar in a big way. By the mid to late 1930s, Scott was picking up steam. In 1936, he appeared in Go West, Young Man with Mae West. A year later, he starred in High, Wide, and Handsome alongside Irene Dunne. In 1938, he played a role in Rebecca of Sunnybrook Farm with Shirley Temple, which further boosted his status. He was quickly rising from someone who primarily did B-movie westerns to a leading man who could carry a film, any film. When his contract with Paramount ended in 1938, it actually gave him more freedom to decide which roles to take. He could be choosy about projects that played to his strengths. In 1940, he co-starred with Cary Grant, a close friend, and at times, the subject of rumors about their personal relationship, in the comedy My Favorite Wife. Their on-screen chemistry was warm and appealing. The audience loved it. Meanwhile, he also made a mark in war movies. In 1939, he did Coast Guard, where he played a Coast Guard officer who gets mixed up in a complicated love story. Then in 1942, came to the shores of Tripoli, following a group of Marine recruits training for battle. Scott continued branching out, proving that he could handle both comedic roles and serious wartime drama. In 1943, he starred in two war films, Bombardier, about airmen on a dangerous bombing mission, and Corvette K-225, where he played a Canadian naval officer protecting his ship from enemy attacks. In 1944, he tried a swashbuckling adventure called Captain Kidd, and then switched to comedy mystery with Home Sweet Homicide in 1945. But by the late 1940s, he fully embraced westerns as his main calling. He launched into a streak of big-budget westerns, often shot in color, which made them visually striking at a time when audiences craved new cinematic experiences. He brought along his Palomino horse, Stardust, who appeared so frequently in his movies that the horse basically became a co-star in its own right. This period saw Scott become a box office draw. In 1950, he was the 10th highest grossing actor, and he held that position in 1951 and 1952 as well. His production company let him control the movies he was in so he could really lean into that tough, introspective cowboy persona that audiences loved. Tall in the saddle with a stoic face that hinted at deeper emotions beneath the surface, he struck a chord with viewers who wanted a hero that wasn't too showy or flashy. Then there was his collaboration with director Bud Boetticher, which truly cemented his legacy as a Western icon. Between the late 1940s and the early 1950s, he starred in numerous films that featured lean, intense plot lines. Among them were titles like Abilene Town, Trail Street, Gunfighters, The Walking Hills, Caribou Trail, Colt Point 45, and Fort Worth. But it was the series of 7 westerns he made with Boetticher that people still talk about. These include 7 Men from Now, 1956, The Tall T, 1957, Ride Lonesome, 1959, and Comanche Station, 1960. In these movies, he often played a man whose pain and sorrow were palpable, even when he hardly spoke. It was his way of embodying the strong, silent hero who carried past wounds, but still managed to triumph over outlaws and injustice with a combination of courage, wit, and moral code. By the time 1962 rolled around, Scott was ready to step away from acting. His final film, Ride the High Country, directed by Sam Peckinpah, also featured Joel McCrea. It told the story of aging lawmen faced with a world that was leaving them behind. The film was both a commercial and critical success, and many folks see it as a perfect swan song for Scott, a seasoned cowboy actor bidding farewell to the big screen with dignity and style. Off-screen, Randolph Scott enjoyed significant financial security. He had a knack for smart investments, and he was known for being a bit thrifty despite his Hollywood fame. Over time, he amassed a nice fortune, which allowed him to live comfortably after retirement. Later in life, he became more religious and formed a close friendship with Reverend Billy Graham. They spent time talking about their beliefs, and Scott found comfort in his faith, which became an important aspect of his life as he grew older. In terms of personal relationships, he married heiress Marion DuPont in 1936, but the marriage lasted only a few years. They divorced in 1939. During his time as a bachelor, he was linked to well-known actresses like Sally Blaine, Claire Trevor, and Dorothy Lamour. But it was actress Patricia Stillman who finally became his lifelong partner. They married in 1944 and adopted 2 children, Christopher and Sandra. The marriage lasted for more than 4 decades until his death. Scott genuinely cherished his family life, and after all his Hollywood adventures, he seemed to find real peace in his home life. Rumors have often swirled around his close friendship with Cary Grant. They shared a house in the 1930s, leading to widespread speculation about whether their relationship was purely platonic. Both men denied anything beyond friendship, and historians still debate it. In any case, they stayed friends for years, and their screen chemistry in My Favorite Wife hinted at an easy rapport. Whether they were just best pals or something more, it clearly made for a fascinating part of old Hollywood gossip. People sometimes forget how many different types of movies Scott made before he settled on being a Western hero. Early on, he did musicals and romantic comedies, even horror. But once Westerns became his focus, he poured all his energy into them. He had the look, the tall frame, the quiet confidence, the intense eyes. And those writing skills he'd learned in the Army, along with a natural ease around horses, gave him an edge. He could gallop across the screen and shoot a rifle without making it seem forced or awkward. Audiences believed him as a frontier lawman or a loner seeking justice. He wasn't a flashy actor. His style was more about subtlety, a raised eyebrow or a small half smile to show that his character was moved or upset. That stoicism became part of his brand, especially in the Buttigieg films, which were known for their spare scripts and gripping tension. Those stories often revolved around moral codes, revenge, or redemption. Scott's characters might start off looking invincible, but there was always a hint of heartbreak lurking beneath. It was compelling to watch. The final showdowns often felt personal, like an emotional release as much as an action set piece. During the early 1950s, he was a box office powerhouse. You'd see his name in the top 10 lists of highest-grossing stars, alongside legends like John Wayne. A big part of his appeal was that he seemed so genuine. He never looked like he was putting on an act, even though Westerns can be pretty stylized. In fact, behind the scenes, colleagues described him as professional, courteous, and punctual. He wasn't a big partier. He took his work seriously and learned everyone's name on set. That attitude earned him a lot of respect among directors, co-stars, and crew members. In 1962, after finishing Ride the High Country, he stepped away from the screen. Maybe he felt he'd said everything he needed to say as an actor, or maybe he wanted to enjoy the fruits of his success without the demands of constant filming. He had a ranch in California, and he was more than happy to live quietly, focusing on his faith, his family, and his leisure. You could find him spending time outdoors, riding horses for fun rather than for a role. He lived until 1987, passing away at 84, leaving behind a hefty filmography of over 100 movies, more than half of which were Westerns. By then, Westerns themselves had undergone significant change, with the genre drifting in and out of fashion. But fans of classic cinema still flock to his films. There's something timeless about that lone rider against a dusty backdrop. And Randolph Scott personified it with such honesty that people still admire him decades later. You can watch Seven Men from now or Ride Lonesome today and see how the themes still resonate. Revenge, redemption, a man's word being his bond, and the struggle to maintain decency in a lawless land. His personal life, while less flashy than some of his contemporaries, remains the subject of curiosity, thanks largely to the Cary Grant rumors and his late-life friendship with Billy Graham. But overall, his reputation is that of a hard-working, disciplined professional who brought authenticity to the screen. He made Westerns that were more than just shootouts and horse chases. They were stories about men who'd been wounded by life, yet kept going because they believed in doing what's right. By the end of his career, he had managed to avoid the typical pitfalls of Hollywood stardom. He didn't blow his fortune on wild living. He didn't succumb to a massive scandal that derailed him. Instead, he used his earnings wisely, had a stable family life, and made the transition to retirement at a time that felt right for him. When you look at his overall journey, you see a man who served in the Army, discovered a love for performing in front of fellow soldiers, wrestled briefly with the idea of playing professional sports, studied acting in New York, paid his dues in small movie parts, got discovered by Paramount, and eventually rode off into the cinematic sunset as one of the biggest stars in Westerns. He even had that partnership with Bud Boetticher, which many film scholars and Western buffs consider a highlight of both men's careers. Those movies are still studied by film students who want to see how to create tight, character-driven Western stories. They weren't big, lavish spectacles like some John Ford or Howard Hawks epics, but they had a raw edge that made them special, and Randolph Scott was at the heart of it, playing characters who never gave up, even if it meant facing down a group of villains alone. In his final film, Ride the High Country, he and Joel McCrea portrayed two aging cowboys confronting a new era. It was almost a reflection of Scott's own situation in life, stepping away from Hollywood as times were changing. The film's success was a testament to the respect he'd built up. Critics loved it, audiences embraced it, and decades later, it remains a classic example of the Western at its best. That's quite a fitting goodbye for a man who had become such a fixture in the genre. He didn't linger on screen too long or fade into obscurity with random bit parts. He went out on top, delivering a final performance that people still discuss today. Beyond the screen, Randolph Scott leaves a legacy of gratitude among fans who admire him for staying true to himself. Many fans praise his calm, gentlemanly demeanor and his capacity to portray layered characters in a genre that can sometimes fall into cliches. Directors, actors, and critics who worked with him or studied his films speak of him with respect. That's not always the case in an industry known for big egos and personal dramas. With Scott, you mostly hear praise for how he handled himself on set and how he lived afterward. His personal life, while less flashy than some of his contemporaries, remains the subject of curiosity, thanks largely to the Cary Grant rumors and his late-life friendship with Billy Graham. But overall, his reputation is that of a hard-working, disciplined professional who brought authenticity to the screen. He made Westerns that were more than just shootouts and horse chases. They were stories about men who'd been wounded by life, yet kept going because they believed in doing what's right. By the end of his career, he had managed to avoid the typical pitfalls of Hollywood stardom. He didn't blow his fortune on wild living. He didn't succumb to a massive scandal that derailed him. Instead, he used his earnings wisely, had a stable family life, and made the transition to retirement at a time that felt right for him. When you look at his overall journey, you see a man who served in the Army, discovered a love for performing in front of fellow soldiers, wrestled briefly with the idea of playing professional sports, studied acting in New York, paid his dues in small movie parts, got discovered by Paramount, and eventually rode off into the cinematic sunset as one of the biggest stars in Westerns. He even had that partnership with Bud Boetticher, which many film scholars and Western buffs consider a highlight of both men's careers. Those movies are still studied by film students who want to see how to create tight, character-driven Western stories. They weren't big, lavish spectacles like some John Ford or Howard Hawks epics, but they had a raw edge that made them special. And Randolph Scott was at the heart of it, playing characters who never gave up, even if it meant facing down a group of villains alone. In his final film, Ride the High Country, he and Joel McCrea portrayed two aging cowboys confronting a new era. It was almost a reflection of Scott's own situation in life, stepping away from Hollywood as times were changing. The film's success was a testament to the respect he'd built up. Critics loved it, audiences embraced it, and decades later, it remains a classic example of the Western at its best. That's quite a fitting goodbye for a man who had become such a fixture in the genre. He didn't linger on screen too long or fade into obscurity with random bit parts. He went out on top, delivering a final performance that people still discuss today. Beyond the screen, Randolph Scott leaves a legacy of gratitude among fans who admire him for staying true to himself. Many fans praise his calm, gentlemanly demeanor and his capacity to portray layered characters in a genre that can sometimes fall into cliches. Directors, actors, and critics who worked with him or studied his films speak of him with respect. That's not always the case in an industry known for big egos and personal dramas. With Scott, you mostly hear praise for how he handled himself on set and how he lived afterward. After retiring, he reportedly never regretted walking away. He was happy out of the limelight with a stable marriage to Patricia Stillman that lasted over 4 decades. Adopting 2 children, Christopher and Sandra, gave him a sense of family beyond the celluloid screen. Unlike some actors who chase fame until it becomes destructive, Scott had the discipline and perspective to know when to step back. In his final years, he turned more toward religion and deepened his friendship with Billy Graham. That might surprise folks who knew him only as the stalwart cowboy on the silver screen, but it aligns with the overall picture of a man who preferred calm reflection and moral grounding. He passed away on March 2nd, 1987 at the age of 84, leaving behind his wife, his children, and a massive legacy of films. He's remembered today as a gentleman of Hollywood's golden era. He didn't create off-screen drama to get attention. He let his work do the talking, and his work remains. If you flip on an old Western channel or go searching for classic American films, you'll find Randolph Scott riding across the frontier, quietly taking on the bad guys and then riding off again. And even though decades have passed since he rode off into that cinematic sunset, fans, both old and new, continue to be drawn to his straightforward style and the reassuring presence he brought to every role. His fans often say he was the epitome of decency, both on screen and off. That's why his movies still resonate. We might be living in a very different time, but there's always going to be something appealing about a hero who believes in fairness and doesn't need to give a long speech about it. Randolph Scott perfected that persona, the cowboy who handles everything with calm determination, the soldier who does his duty, the quiet type who still commands respect. Every once in a while, you'll catch a hint of heartbreak behind those eyes, a flicker of vulnerability. That balance between strength and sadness is what made him unforgettable. Even if you're not a huge Western buff, you can appreciate what he accomplished. He built a filmography of around 100 movies, left a mark on multiple genres, and ended up with a permanent place in Hollywood history. People who knew him personally spoke well of him, remembering how he was always prepared, patient, and willing to offer a kind word or a gesture of support. He didn't let fame get to his head. He genuinely liked people and respected the craft of making movies. So if you ever find yourself curious about the golden age of Hollywood Westerns, set aside some time and pick a Randolph Scott classic. Maybe Ride Lonesome or The Tall T. Watch the way he carries himself, how he handles his lines, how he interacts with the rest of the cast. Pay attention to his eyes, which often tell more than the dialogue does. That's where the real Randolph Scott artistry shines. And when the movie's over, you'll probably understand why his name still pops up in conversations about the finest cowboy stars in film history. And that is the story of Randolph Scott, the tall, quietly confident cowboy who started off in the Army, tried his hand at musicals, comedies, horrors, and war dramas, but always found his way back to the open range. Through discipline, natural talent, and a good heart, he rose to the top of his profession, all while maintaining his integrity and sense of self. Generations later, we can still appreciate the calm strength he brought to every role. His films remain timeless, and the man himself stands as a testament to what passion, humility, and perseverance can achieve in the world of entertainment. That's why people still tip their hats to Randolph Scott. He made it all look so effortless when in reality, he'd earned every bit of that success through hard work, a solid upbringing, a bit of luck, and a whole lot of heart.